She had everything the world could offer. A mansion in Beverly Hills, an empire worth billions, a name that commanded fear and respect. And yet, on one stormy night in Los Angeles, Eleanor Hayes stepped out of her black limousine and froze. There, in the pouring rain, stood a boy. Barefoot, shivering, clutching two crying infants in his arms. Their eyes, hazel, golden brown, the same eyes as her late husband. In that moment, her entire life of silence, wealth, and power was about to collapse. This is not a story about money. It's a story about secrets, betrayal, and the family she never knew existed. You're watching Black Voice Matter, where hidden truths and untold stories come to life. Stay with us as we step back in time to understand the woman behind the mansion. Beverly Hills at night sparkles like a diamond scattered across the hills of California. Palm trees sway in the soft wind. Luxury boutiques line the streets. And on the ridges above Sunset Boulevard, the mansions glow like constellations in the dark. One of those mansions belongs to Eleanor Hayes. People in Los Angeles know her name. When she walks into a room, heads turn, not only because she's beautiful, but because she carries herself like a queen. Tall, composed, eyes that look through you, rather than at you. Eleanor Hayes is one of the wealthiest women in America. A widow, a power broker, a woman who built an empire and now lives alone inside a palace of glass and marble. Inside, the house is breathtaking. Italian marble floors, Fendi couches, art pieces from Paris and Tokyo, a pool that stretches like a small river across the back garden. Every room curated by designers who charge more for a single chair than most families earn in a year. But beauty can be deceiving, because when the lights go down, the silence rises. A silence so heavy it presses against the walls. That silence is Eleanor's true companion. She sits most nights in a grand living room meant for parties, a chandelier above, a piano playing soft jazz automatically. No one listens, no one laughs. No one shares the moment with her. She often thinks of her late husband, Richard Hayes, once celebrated. Now a portrait on the wall, framed in gold, staring back at her in silence. They never had children. All the IVF treatments, all the hospital visits, every tear shed in sterile rooms. They left her with nothing but emptiness. When Richard died 3 years ago, Eleanor didn't just lose a husband. She lost the last person who called her by her first name, without fear, without calculation. In Beverly Hills, people whisper, "She's cold. She has no family. She only loves her money." But the truth is different. Behind that mask of steel lies a heart that once prayed for a child, that once longed for laughter echoing through the halls. Now, all that remains is routine. Meetings, travel, boardrooms filled with men who smile too wide and bow too quickly. At the end of the day, she comes home to a house filled with everything except life. Eleanor sometimes stands before the mirror late at night. She sees the sharp cheekbones, the flawless hair, the expensive silk robe. But her eyes are red from sleepless nights. She recalls a quote by Marilyn Monroe. "The truth is, I've never fooled anyone. I've let people fool themselves. They didn't bother to find out who I really was." Eleanor whispers to her reflection. "They never bother with me either." Great wealth brings power, and Eleanor has plenty of it. She can move markets with a single decision. She can silence rivals with one phone call. She can buy anything she desires. Anything, except a hand to hold when she's afraid, except a voice to say, "I need you," except a family. This is the paradox of the rich and the powerful. Howard Hughes had it. Michael Jackson lived it. Surrounded by billions, yet impoverished in the one currency that matters most: love. On a gray Los Angeles morning, Eleanor stood on her balcony, looking down at the city below. Cars honked on Wilshire Boulevard. Private jets cut across the blue sky. Employees and guards moved about the property, busy with their duties. She realized something then. I can command an empire, she thought, but I can't command the silence in my heart. What she didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that her life was about to shift. Not through a business deal, not through another gala in Hollywood, but through a storm. A rare Los Angeles rainstorm that would wash over her life like a flood. It would bring her face to face with a skinny boy clutching two crying babies in his arms. And in that single moment, everything she thought she knew about herself and about love would shatter. The rain was coming, and with it, the beginning of a story Eleanor Hayes never imagined would be hers. Los Angeles is not a city known for storms. But that Thursday afternoon, the sky broke open. Heavy clouds swallowed the sun. Thunder rolled across the hills like distant artillery fire. Then the rain came, first in drops, then in sheets, pounding against rooftops, drowning the city in a gray blur. The streets of Beverly Hills choked with cars. Horns blared. Pedestrians sprinted for cover. Umbrellas flipped inside out. Vendors rushed to cover their stalls with cheap tarps. The city of glamour suddenly looked fragile, like makeup washed away in tears. Inside the back seat of her black limousine, Eleanor Hayes sat in silence. Her driver muttered about the traffic, suggesting a shortcut. But Eleanor wasn't listening. Her phone buzzed with another rescheduled meeting. Her empire could wait. Her mind was elsewhere, staring blankly through raindrops racing down the tinted glass. Then, something caught her eye. At first, just a blur near the median of the road. A figure, small and trembling, pressed against a light pole as water cascaded around him. Eleanor leaned forward. Her chest tightened. It was a boy, no older than 13, barefoot, soaked to the bone. In his thin arms, he clutched two infants, swaddled in nothing but plastic bags and tattered cloth. The baby's cries were muffled, sharp, cutting even through the thick glass of the limousine. The sight froze her. In a city of Bentleys and billboards, no one stopped. Cars hissed past. Drivers looked away. Some shook their heads, muttering about street scams. To everyone else, this boy was invisible, but not to Eleanor. Her eyes locked on the babies' faces. Something stirred inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not guilt, something deeper. Recognition. One of the infants tilted her tiny face upward, her eyes opened, hazel, golden brown, the exact shade of Richard's eyes. The husband Eleanor buried 3 years ago. She blinked. Impossible, she whispered. Maybe it was the stormlight. Maybe her mind was playing cruel tricks. But then the other baby stirred, and the same eyes stared back. Her heart slammed against her chest. The driver's voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, do you want me to keep moving? These kids pull scams. Sometimes they even rent babies to beg." Eleanor snapped her gaze to him. "Stop the car." He hesitated. "Ma'am." "Stop. The car." Tires screeched against wet asphalt. Before the driver could grab an umbrella, Eleanor had already thrown open the door. Rain pelted her silk dress. Her heels sank into the flooded gutter, but she didn't care. She walked straight toward the boy, each step splashing, each second louder than the storm. The boy's eyes widened in fear. He tightened his grip on the babies. His lips trembled. He looked like a stray animal, ready to bolt at any sudden move. "Who are you?" Eleanor's voice was steady, though her pulse thundered in her ears. The boy swallowed hard. I'm Ethan." Her gaze dropped to the infants. "Are they yours?" His chin quivered. "They're my sisters." A pause, then almost inaudible. "I'm their father." Eleanor's breath caught. "You're 13. "I'm strong enough," he said quickly, though his voice cracked. The rain poured harder. One of the babies let out a weak, rasping cry. Eleanor reached out instinctively, but the boy stepped back. "Please, don't take them. They're all I have." She knelt, the storm soaking her hair, mascara running. "No one's taking them from you. Not the police. Not anyone. But you can't survive out here like this." The boy's lips trembled. For a moment, it seemed he would collapse. But he held the infants tighter, like a soldier shielding his wounded. In that moment, Eleanor remembered something buried deep in her past. A memory from long ago, when she had toured a war memorial with Richard. She'd met an old veteran there. The man told her about a night in Vietnam, when the rain fell heavy after an air raid. He described walking through a ruined village. The huts were gone, the smoke still rising. And in the middle of the mud, he found a child, no more than 5, holding a baby brother wrapped in rags. The boy didn't cry. He just stood there, shivering, protecting the baby with his small arms. The veteran said he never forgot those eyes. Eyes that carried fear, yes, but also defiance, the will to survive. Now, staring at Ethan, Eleanor felt the same chill. This boy was not a trickster. He was not an act. He was real, and he was drowning in a storm life had thrown at him. Her driver rushed over with an umbrella. "Ma'am, you'll get sick." Eleanor waved him off. "Bring them into the car, now." The boy shook his head. "No police," he begged. "I won't survive if you hand us to them." Eleanor's voice softened. "No police, I promise. But you can't stand here another second." Ethan hesitated. Then slowly, he stepped forward. The rain dripped from his hair, his thin shirt clinging to his skin. Every movement screamed exhaustion. Eleanor reached out. The infants stirred against her chest, their skin ice cold. She wrapped her cashmere scarf around them, cradling them close. For the first time in years, she felt something break inside her. A crack in the ice. A warmth she thought she'd buried forever. Back inside the limousine, the windows fogged with warmth. The storm raged outside, but in her lap, the babies finally quieted, their breathing shallow but steady, their tiny chests rising and falling against her silk scarf. Ethan sat stiffly at the far corner, dripping water on the leather seats. His eyes darted between the glowing dashboard and Eleanor's face. He looked like he'd stepped into another world, one he didn't belong to. Eleanor couldn't stop staring at the infants. Those eyes. Richard's eyes. A truth was forming inside her. A truth she wasn't ready to face, yet couldn't escape. Something had led her to this storm. Something had placed these children in her path. And she knew, deep down, her life would never return to silence again. The rain had brought them together, but the storm inside Eleanor Hayes was only beginning. The storm outside had begun to quiet, but inside Eleanor Hayes's limousine, a different storm was rising. The babies rested on her lap, wrapped in her scarf. Their tiny fists curled, their damp lashes clumped from the rain. And then it happened. The moment that pierced her deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever could. One of the infants stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and in that fragile face beneath the storm's fading glow, Eleanor saw it. Those eyes, hazel, golden brown, the exact shade that had once stared at her across a candlelit table, had once whispered promises in the dark. The eyes of Richard Hayes. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. "No," she whispered under her breath, barely audible, as if saying the word could rewrite reality. But then the second child moved. Grace, the twin, opened her gaze, and the same rare light poured out. It was undeniable. Two infants, strangers to her world of marble and glass, carried the unmistakable mark of her late husband. Eleanor's heart pounded. Her pulse roared in her ears louder than the rain on the roof. The limousine's leather interior closed in on her. Every breath felt like a confession. Could it be? Had Richard, her Richard, the man who once pressed her hand and said, "We're in this together," hidden an entire life from her? Her mind scrambled for excuses. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe her eyes were tricking her. But no. Richard's eyes had always been the rarest shade, a color that drew people in, a color she had fallen in love with. It was not coincidence. It was blood. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, concerned. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her lips pressed tight. Her gaze locked on the twins. She couldn't let her voice betray the war inside her chest. The car moved slowly through the wet streets, but in her mind, Eleanor was far away. She was back at the hospital years ago, sitting in a sterile white room, clutching Richard's hand. Doctors explained failed procedures in cold, clinical tones. She remembered the ache in her chest when she realized she might never hold a child of her own. Richard had kissed her forehead that day. He whispered, "It doesn't matter. We have each other." And she had believed him. She had believed every word. Now, staring at Lily and Grace, she realized those words were half a lie. He had found fatherhood, just not with her. Eleanor closed her eyes, but behind her eyelids, memories flashed like lightning. Richard smiling in their wedding photos. Richard laughing at their anniversary dinner. Richard promising, always promising. And now, two infants with his eyes. Proof that promises meant nothing. Her chest burned. Anger, grief, humiliation. They all tangled until she could no longer tell one from the other. In American high society, betrayal is more than heartbreak. It is exposure. It is scandal. It is the kind of story tabloids devour and competitors exploit. History had its examples. The Rockefeller family once faced quiet disputes over heirs born out of wedlock. The Kennedy dynasty, so polished in public, carried whispers of secret children, rumors that lingered like shadows at every gala. In a world where legacy and bloodlines determine power, an illegitimate child is more than a secret. It is a weapon. And now, Eleanor realized, she might be standing at the edge of her own dynasty's collapse. She looked at Ethan, the boy sitting stiffly at the far end of the seat. His eyes darted, nervous, searching, but when they landed on his sisters, there was a softness there, a protectiveness Eleanor couldn't ignore. Was he Richard's too? Was this boy, with his threadbare clothes and dirt-streaked face, her late husband's son? The thought struck her like a blade. If true, then Richard had not just cheated her of children. He had built another family in the shadows, leaving Eleanor to mourn alone while his bloodline lived on. Her chest tightened. She thought of the whispers already circling in Beverly Hills. They say she's alone. They say she only has money. What would they say now? That she had been deceived, outmaneuvered by a man in his grave. A cruel irony settled in her gut. She had been mocked for being childless, pitied behind closed doors. Now she faced the truth. Richard had children all along, children she had never known, never held, never even imagined. The babies stirred again, soft cries breaking the silence. Eleanor reached down to adjust the scarf around them. Their tiny fingers brushed her skin, and she froze. It was the gentlest touch, yet it cracked something inside her. Tears she had held back for years welled up. She turned her face to the window, ashamed to let the boy see her weakness. In the depths of her turmoil, she remembered a line once spoken by an elder matriarch at a charity gala. Secrets in wealthy families are never buried. They are planted, and one day they grow into storms. Eleanor had dismissed the comment at the time as melodrama. Now she felt the truth of it in her bones. These children, they were the storm, and she was standing in its eye. For the first time, she asked herself a question she wasn't ready to answer. What if they belonged here? What if fate had dragged her into this storm not to punish her, but to show her a family she never thought she'd have? The thought terrified her, because accepting it would mean rewriting everything she believed about Richard, about herself, about her life of wealth and silence. The limousine pulled into the driveway of her mansion. The gates opened slowly, as if even the metal sensed hesitation. Ethan's mouth fell open at the sight of the estate, but Eleanor's gaze never left the children. The rain still fell lightly, cleansing the streets, washing away footprints and dirt. It was as if the city itself whispered, "Nothing stays hidden forever." The eyes had spoken the truth. Now Eleanor would have to decide what to do with it. The twins slept soundly now, tucked in fresh blankets brought down from storage. The storm had passed, leaving the night unnervingly still. Inside the mansion, the air smelled of lemon polish and warm bread. The contrast was unbearable. Two children rescued from the cold streets, now breathing softly in a room that had never known struggle. Eleanor Hayes stood by the crib, arms crossed, eyes fixed on their tiny chests rising and falling. Her mind refused to quiet. Questions gnawed at her. She turned to the boy sitting on the couch nearby, his knees pulled to his chest. His wet hair clung to his forehead. His clothes, an oversized shirt lent by one of the staff, hung loosely on his frail frame. But his eyes, they carried years far beyond his age. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Tell me, how long have you been out there? With them?" The boy looked down at his hands. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "Since the night they were born." Eleanor's breath caught. She moved closer. "What do you mean?" His fingers tightened into fists. "My mom, Sarah, she didn't make it. She died that night, at the clinic." He swallowed hard. "They gave me my sisters and told me there was nothing more they could do. So I carried them out. And I never went back." The words struck Eleanor like a blow. She had lost Richard, yes. But this boy had lost everything in a single night. A mother, a home, a childhood. Ethan's voice trembled as he went on. "At first, a neighbor helped. She gave me food sometimes. But when the twins kept crying, she said we couldn't stay. So I found shelter where I could. Behind churches, under bus stops, anywhere the rain didn't reach." He lifted his eyes, raw and unflinching. I fed them with whatever I could find. Bread soaked in water. On good days, someone gave me a little milk. Most nights, I just prayed they would wake up in the morning. Eleanor gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Her empire was built on precision and control. But here was a boy who had survived chaos with nothing but willpower. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence. But Eleanor felt colder than ever. 13 years old, she whispered. You should be in school. You should be... She stopped herself. The obvious truth hung in the air. He should be many things. But life had made him something else. Ethan straightened his back, his voice firmer now. I'm not asking for pity, ma'am. I couldn't leave them. They're my sisters. They're all I have. For a long moment, Eleanor couldn't speak. Her mind spun with images. This boy, drenched in rain, cradling 2 newborns. This boy scavenging for scraps on the streets of Los Angeles while she dined under chandeliers. This boy fighting a battle every single day. A battle she never even knew existed. And beneath it all, the echo of Richard's eyes stared back at her from the crib. The bigger picture child homelessness in Los Angeles was not new. Eleanor had read the reports before. She had even signed checks at galas, applauding causes she never thought would touch her. But now, the statistics weren't numbers. They were flesh and bone in her guest room. According to city data, more than 66,000 people were homeless in Los Angeles County. Among them, thousands were children, kids sleeping in cars, tents, and makeshift shelters. Every winter, headlines screamed about the crisis on Skid Row. But people like Eleanor had always thought of it as someone else's tragedy. Tonight, tragedy had walked straight into her home. Ethan's story stirred something buried deep within her, a memory long suppressed. Years ago, during a fundraiser for veterans, she had met a man who served in Iraq. He told her about the aftermath of a bombing in Baghdad, how he saw children wandering streets filled with rubble. No parents, no home. Just wide eyes staring at soldiers, clutching younger siblings the way Ethan did now. The veteran's voice had broken when he said, I've faced bullets, I've faced fire, but nothing haunts me like those children. They were too young to fight. Yet life had drafted them anyway. Eleanor remembered how the room went silent after his words. But the silence didn't last. Someone raised a glass, the music resumed, and the world forgot. She forgot. Until now. She studied Ethan again, his small frame, his trembling hands. And yet, the steel in his gaze. He was not a beggar, not a scam, not a child waiting for rescue. He was a survivor. And survivors were dangerous because they exposed the illusions of comfort the wealthy built around themselves. Eleanor realized, with a mix of dread and awe, that Ethan Miller had survived more at 13 than she ever had in a lifetime of power. Her thoughts swirled. If the world discovered this truth, that Richard Hayes had fathered children outside their marriage, it would be scandal enough to make front pages for months. But the story of those children's survival, it would crush her carefully crafted image. And yet, as she looked at Ethan and the twins, she felt the weight of choice pressing down. Would she bury this secret to protect her empire, or embrace it, risking everything? Ethan lowered his head. I don't care about your money, ma'am. I don't even care about your house. I just need them to live. That's all. The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any accusation. For a woman surrounded by excess, The raw plea for survival shook her to her core. Eleanor sat down, suddenly exhausted. She whispered almost to herself, "God help me. I don't even know who I am anymore." The boy's confession had changed everything. Now only one thing could confirm the unthinkable: the truth hidden in blood itself. The mansion was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that hums in the bones. The kind that makes every clock tick louder, every breath heavier. Dr. Collins stood in the guest room, pulling on gloves. His black medical kit lay open on the table, cotton swabs and vials neatly arranged. Eleanor Hayes stood nearby, arms folded tight, her gaze locked on the twins resting in their crib. They were calm now, wrapped in fresh linen, but their eyes, those haunting eyes, still burned in her memory like fire she couldn't put out. Dr. Collins cleared his throat gently. "May I?" Eleanor gave a stiff nod. The doctor leaned over, swabbing the inside of each baby's cheek with delicate care. The infants stirred, but did not cry, tiny, innocent, unaware that their saliva might topple an empire. When the samples were sealed, Dr. Collins straightened. "It will take 48 hours, perhaps less." Eleanor's voice was low, almost breaking. "I want it rushed. Cost is irrelevant." The doctor met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I'll call as soon as results are in." As he left, Eleanor remained by the crib, her hand hovering above the twins' foreheads, close enough to feel their warmth, but afraid to touch. She whispered to herself, "If this is true, then everything I believed about him was a lie." That night she couldn't sleep. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and stared at the city lights twinkling across Los Angeles. Memories attacked her relentlessly. Richard's laughter at their wedding, his promises during IVF treatments, "We'll get through this." His tender words when she wept, "You are enough. Children don't define us." But children had defined him, secretly, silently, cruelly. The next morning, she wandered into Richard's old study. She hadn't set foot there since his death. The air was thick with dust, the curtains drawn, as if the room itself had mourned with her. She opened drawers absent-mindedly, papers, old bank statements, pens still neatly aligned, and then a wooden box. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, bundles of letters, carefully folded, their paper yellowing at the edges. She picked one up. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. Her throat tightened as she read. "Richard, thank you for last weekend. Ethan was so happy to see you. I wish you could stay longer. I understand your life is complicated, but know that I expect nothing. Just come when you can. Sarah." Eleanor's hands shook. She dropped the letter, grabbed another. "Toby asks about you every day. I tell him you're busy saving the world. I don't want him to hate you, so I only tell him good things. But Richard, sometimes I wish you would just tell her. Tell your wife the truth. She deserves to know." Eleanor staggered back, clutching the desk for balance. Tears blurred her vision. The betrayal was no longer suspicion. It was ink on paper. It was love letters tucked away like contraband. It was her husband's second life, hidden in her own house. She sank into the leather chair. Letters scattered across her lap. Her chest heaved. The humiliation was unbearable. In high society, betrayal isn't private. It leaks. It gossips. It corrodes reputations faster than acid. The Rockefellers once fought bitter inheritance disputes when illegitimate children appeared. The Kennedys, America's political royalty, were plagued with whispers of affairs and hidden heirs. Even in modern boardrooms, Scandals of betrayal ripple through corporations. When Jeff Bezos's affair became public, Amazon's stock dipped. When Bill and Melinda Gates divorced, the foundation they built shook under scrutiny. And now Eleanor, the Iron Woman of Beverly Hills, stood on the brink of a scandal that could swallow her name, her company, her entire legacy. Yet beneath the rage and humiliation, another feeling clawed at her: grief. Because Richard was not here to face her. He had left her with questions only he could answer. And worst of all, he had left her with children who bore his eyes. Children she hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. 2 days later, the phone rang. Dr. Collins, his voice steady, clinical. "Mrs. Hayes, the results are back." Her hand shook as she held the receiver, her throat dry. She managed only one word. "And?" A pause, then the words that crushed her completely. "The probability of paternity is 99.98%. Richard Hayes is the biological father of both children." The room spun. The letters fell from her lap. Her wine glass tipped, crimson spilling across the rug like blood. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs she had not allowed herself in years. "It's true," she whispered. "They're his. They were his all along." Hours passed before she could move. When she finally stood, her reflection in the mirror startled her. Mascara smeared, eyes swollen, a queen reduced to ruins. She thought of Sarah, the woman Richard had chosen in secret. A teacher, a mother, a woman who carried what Eleanor never could. And yet Sarah had died alone, without security, without wealth, leaving her children to a boy too young to be their savior. For the first time, Eleanor felt something other than rage. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. She looked again at the twins sleeping peacefully upstairs. They were innocent. They had not asked to be born into scandal. They carried no blame, but they carried Richard's blood. And that meant, whether she liked it or not, they carried hers. That night she walked through the halls of her mansion, her heels clicking against marble. Each step echoed like judgment. She whispered to herself, "This is my cross. He gave me silence, but they gave me truth." The DNA had spoken. The letters had confessed. Now, Eleanor Hayes would have to face not just her late husband's betrayal, but the war it would ignite in the world of wealth and power she ruled. The night stretched endlessly. Rain had stopped, but inside Eleanor Hayes's mansion, a storm still tore through her chest. She sat alone in her bedroom. The letters from Sarah spread out across the bed like evidence in a trial. The DNA report lay on the nightstand, a single page that had destroyed 10 years of marriage in one breath. Her eyes burned, but she could not close them. Because when she did, the memories came rushing back. White walls, cold floors, the hum of fluorescent lights. Eleanor could see it all. The sterile clinics where she and Richard had tried, again and again, to create life together. She remembered sitting on the exam table, her hands trembling as a doctor explained percentages and probabilities. She remembered Richard holding her hand, pressing it gently, telling her, "It's not your fault. We'll try again. We're in this together." She remembered crying into his chest afterward, the fabric of his suit soaking with her tears. And he whispered, "Even without children, you are enough for me." Those words had been her anchor, her lifeline. And now, those words were lies. Because while she injected hormones into her body, while she endured needles, surgeries, and the slow death of hope, Richard had already become a father, just not with her. The betrayal cut deeper than infidelity. It wasn't just another woman. It was the very thing she longed for most, stolen from her, given freely to someone else. Her womb had become a battlefield, and she had lost, while Sarah had won, without even trying. Eleanor's chest tightened. She clutched the sheets, biting back a scream that threatened to rip her apart. In America, betrayal is never just personal, especially in marriages like hers, marriages that merge fortunes, reputations, dynasties. When love collapses in ordinary homes, it leaves broken hearts. But when love collapses in mansions, it leaves broken empires. She thought of Jeff Bezos, whose affair ignited the most expensive divorce in history, a split that reshaped Amazon itself, sending shockwaves through Wall Street. She thought of Bill Gates, his quiet separation with Melinda, followed by questions about his ties, his secrets, rumors that tarnished the image of a philanthropic empire. In high society, marriage is not only love, it is a contract, a business alliance, a fortress of perception. And betrayal tears that fortress down brick by brick. Now Eleanor faced the same ruin. Richard was gone, but his secrets were alive. And they had names: Lily, Grace, Ethan. She rose and walked to the mirror. The reflection staring back was unrecognizable. Her cheekbones were still sharp, her hair still perfectly blonde, her silk robe shimmered under the dim light. But her eyes, they were hollow. Not the eyes of a queen, the eyes of a woman gutted by betrayal. She whispered bitterly to her reflection, "Was I ever enough for you? Or was I only ever your cover story?" The silence of the room answered her. Eleanor poured herself whiskey. The burn in her throat matched the fire in her veins. Images collided in her mind. Richard smiling in family photos. Richard kissing her hand in public. The perfect husband. The envy of dinner parties. And then the letters. The children's eyes. The DNA report. She slammed the glass down, shattering it across the table. The truth was too sharp to hold, too bitter to swallow. All those years she had blamed herself, every failed treatment, every hushed conversation with doctors, every sympathetic glance from friends. She carried it like a scarlet letter. Maybe I was broken. Maybe I wasn't worthy of motherhood. But Richard had been fertile all along. He could have been a father any time. And he was. Just not with her. The humiliation was unbearable. She had sat through board meetings where men smirked about the childless widow. She had endured gossip at fundraisers, women whispering behind champagne glasses. And all the while, the truth was that Richard had a secret family, a family thriving in shadows while she rotted in silence. American culture loves a redemption story, but it also loves scandal more. Eleanor knew the rules. One whisper of Richard's betrayal would spread like wildfire. The press would feast. Her board members would circle like vultures. Investors would demand answers. She was not just a widow now. She was a woman deceived. A woman whose empire stood on quicksand. Her entire identity, the elegant, untouchable Eleanor Hayes, was unraveling. She found herself walking into the gallery hallway, where portraits of her and Richard hung in gold frames. At one picture, taken on their 10th anniversary, they smiled at each other like teenagers. Her hand rested on his chest. His eyes glowed with the same hazel as the twins. She wanted to rip the frame from the wall. She wanted to smash it to pieces. But she couldn't. Because part of her still loved him. And that was the cruelest betrayal of all. She paced the mansion's endless corridors. One moment, she swore she would never acknowledge the children. The next, she imagined cradling them forever. One moment, she wanted to expose Richard as a fraud. The next, she wanted to protect his image, because destroying him meant destroying herself. Love and hate twisted inside her like barbed wire. There was no release. At dawn, she stood on the balcony, watching the city below awaken. Cars streamed down Wilshire. Joggers moved along the sidewalks. Life continued, indifferent to her storm. But Eleanor knew her life would never be the same. The truth had surfaced, and truth has a way of rewriting futures. She whispered to the wind, "I wanted a child. Now fate has given me 3. What am I supposed to do with them?" The pain of betrayal had consumed her, but outside her mansion walls, forces were already moving. Family, board members, vultures circling. The war for Richard's legacy was about to begin. Sunday evening in Beverly Hills carried an uneasy stillness. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of gold, but inside Eleanor Hayes' mansion, the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. The staff whispered nervously in the hallways. They all knew who was coming. 3 black SUVs rolled into the driveway, their engines growling like predators closing in on prey. Out stepped Charles Hayes, Richard's elder brother. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that could turn any room into a battlefield. 2 younger cousins followed behind, dressed in expensive abatas, dark sunglasses shielding their eyes. They entered the mansion as though it already belonged to them. Eleanor didn't rise from her chair. She sat on the leather sofa in the center of the grand living room, legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. The fading sunlight caught her face, illuminating the sharp lines of a woman who had already survived a storm. Her voice was steady, almost cold. "Good afternoon." Charles didn't bother with pleasantries. His voice rumbled through the room. "I hear you've taken in a boy from the streets. And 2 babies? People say they're Richard's." Eleanor set her glass down gently on the table. "They're not just people's words. They're the truth." A bitter laugh escaped one of the cousins. "You honestly believe that street kid? That's ridiculous." Without a word, Eleanor reached for a file resting on the table and slid it toward Charles. "Read." He opened it. DNA results. Dr. Collins's seal in red ink, proof that Richard Hayes was the biological father of the twins. Charles's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked over the numbers again and again, as if by staring hard enough, he could change them. "This can't be," he muttered. Eleanor rose to her feet, her presence as commanding as the chandelier above them. "They carry Richard's blood, which means they carry the Hayes bloodline." Charles slammed the file shut. "That doesn't give them the right to inherit. Richard never named them in his will. No documents, no recognition, nothing." Eleanor's eyes blazed. "You forget the law. In this country, once paternity is proven, children, inside or outside of marriage, can claim their share, and I will fight for them." The room went silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner felt like it had stopped. From the hallway, Ethan watched quietly, his fists clenched. He didn't understand all the legal terms, but he understood this. Someone was finally standing for him and his sisters. Charles broke the silence, his tone sharp as glass. "Then we'll see each other in court." The first hearing in New York drew crowds the way a Broadway premiere might. Photographers swarmed the courthouse steps. Headlines screamed from every newsstand. "Hayes dynasty faces heir scandal." "Secret children threaten billion-dollar fortune." Eleanor arrived in a tailored navy suit, chin lifted high. Behind her walked Ethan, shy but unflinching, the twins left safe at the mansion. Across the aisle sat Charles with a team of lawyers dressed like generals ready for war. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. Charles's attorney spoke first, voice booming with confidence. Richard Hayes never acknowledged these children. His will clearly directs all assets to his widow and charitable foundations. We cannot allow impostors to dismantle a legacy on nothing but hearsay. Then Eleanor's lawyer stood, calm but forceful. Your Honor, this is not hearsay. This is science. We present DNA evidence confirming with 99.98% certainty that the children are Richard Hayes's biological offspring. Under New York law, biological children, legitimate or not, are entitled to claim inheritance unless explicitly disinherited. These children are not imposters. They are his truth. The room erupted in murmurs, reporters furiously typing every word. Eleanor sat silently, her heart pounding. Every phrase about secret children cut through her like a knife. For years she had been paraded as Richard's perfect wife, the elegant widow at the head of a dynasty. Now she was forced to stand in public and admit that her marriage had been a lie, that she had been deceived. Yet, beneath the humiliation, something fierce grew inside her. This battle was no longer about image. It was about 3 children who had been left in the rain while men like Charles circled for power. America had seen scandals like this before. When Prince died without a will, the courts were flooded with hundreds of claimants, each demanding a piece of his empire. Only DNA testing settled the matter, cutting through rumor with fact. Wealth may complicate the narrative, but blood never lies. Eleanor's turn came. She was called to the stand. Charles's lawyer leaned forward, voice sharp. Mrs. Hayes, did you know your husband was unfaithful? A hush fell across the courtroom. Eleanor drew in a long breath. Her voice was clear. No, I didn't know. But now I do. And I will not deny it anymore. These children are not a shameful secret. They are innocent. And I will protect them, no matter what it costs me. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence. Then the clicking of cameras began again, a frenzy of sound as reporters captured the declaration of a woman who refused to be broken. In that moment, Eleanor realized something profound. Dignity was not in hiding the truth. Dignity was standing in it, even if it burned. The case was far from over, but Eleanor had crossed the line of no return. What began as whispers in her mansion had now exploded into a public war over legacy, blood, and power. Outside, the press shouted questions, microphones shoved in her direction. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply walked past them, Ethan trailing close behind, his small hand brushing against hers. And in that fleeting touch, she found her answer. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It wasn't even about the company. It was about 3 children, and whether she had the courage to become their mother in a world that would rather erase them. The family battle had only begun, and New York was just the first battlefield. The courtroom battles had left Eleanor drained. Her nights were restless, her days a constant blur of lawyers, reporters, and whispers echoing through the marble halls of her mansion. But amidst the storm, something unexpected had begun to take root. A tenderness she hadn't felt in decades. It was in the small things. The way Lily laughed when Grace tugged her blanket away. The way Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud from a torn library book, his voice cracking but determined. The way the house, once filled only with silence, now vibrated with the rhythm of life. And Eleanor realized something terrifying. She was beginning to love them. Not as Richard's shame, not as evidence in a trial, but as her own. One morning, she entered the nursery just as dawn spilled gold across the curtains. Ethan had fallen asleep on the rug, his arm stretched protectively across the crib. Lily and Grace were giggling at nothing, their eyes, Richard's eyes, shining like sunlight through whiskey. Eleanor stood frozen. Her chest tightened, but not from grief this time, from recognition, from the dawning truth that love was no longer a choice she could avoid. She whispered aloud, almost to herself, "I can't let them go. Not now. Not ever." That afternoon, she summoned her lawyer, Barrister Ayatunde. He arrived with his leather briefcase and cautious eyes. Eleanor didn't waste time. "Draw up the papers," she said. He blinked. "What papers, ma'am?" "For adoption. All 3 children. Full guardianship. Legal, permanent, irrevocable." The lawyer hesitated. "You understand, this will not just be a private matter. It will trigger more media, more opposition from the Hayes family. Charles will—" "Let him fight," Eleanor cut in, her voice like steel. "This isn't about him anymore. This is about me and them." 2 weeks later, she found herself in a quiet family court in Los Angeles. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes but a strict manner, looked down from the bench. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "you are petitioning to adopt Ethan Miller and his sisters, Lily and Grace. Do you understand that adoption is permanent? That you assume not only financial responsibility, but the emotional and parental duties as well?" Eleanor's heart hammered. Her hands trembled as she answered, "Yes, I understand." The judge leaned forward. "Why do you want this?" The room seemed to shrink, all sound fading except Eleanor's voice. "Because they deserve more than survival. Because they are not mistakes, not secrets. They are children, my children now. And because love is the only inheritance worth fighting for." Silence. Then the judge nodded slowly. "Very well. The petition is granted." The gavel struck. It was done. Back at the mansion, the papers were placed before her. Guardianship documents, amendments to her will. Each page a promise carved in ink. She picked up the pen. For a moment her hand hovered, trembling, as if the weight of history pressed against it. Then, with steady strokes, she signed. One page, then another, and another. By the time she put the pen down, she was no longer just Eleanor Hayes, widow of Richard. She was Eleanor Hayes, mother of Ethan, Lily, and Grace. Her eyes filled with tears, not of weakness, but of release. A lifetime of silence cracked open, and something new rushed in. That evening, Ethan approached her, clutching his threadbare backpack. "Ma'am," he whispered, "they told me at court. You're really my mom now?" Eleanor knelt before him, her hands gently resting on his thin shoulders. "Yes," she said softly, "if you'll let me be." The boy's lips quivered. For the first time, he didn't hold back. He threw his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. "Thank you," he sobbed. "Thank you for not leaving us." Eleanor held him tight, rocking him like a mother would a much younger child. In that moment, the marble walls of the mansion didn't feel cold anymore. They felt alive. Adoption in America carries a weight far beyond paperwork. It is not only a legal bond, it is a symbol. It says, blood doesn't decide family. Love does. From Hollywood celebrities adopting across continents, to everyday foster parents opening their homes to strangers, adoption has long been seen as both radical and redemptive. Oprah Winfrey, one of the most powerful women in America, never formally adopted, but her philanthropic work has changed the lives of thousands of children. She built schools, paid tuitions, mentored young girls from poverty into positions of leadership. In a way, she became a mother to many, proving that parenthood is as much about presence as biology. Eleanor thought of that often. She wasn't simply filling a legal role. She was choosing to step into a human one. And in that choice, she was no longer defined by betrayal, but by redemption. Of course, the world outside her gates did not see it so simply. News outlets ran headlines. Billionaire widow adopts husband's secret children. Talk shows debated whether it was nobility or damage control. Pundits speculated about inheritance, corporate control, political influence. But inside the mansion, none of that mattered. What mattered was the laughter echoing through the halls. What mattered was Ethan's newfound courage, Lily's giggles, Grace's steady gaze. What mattered was that Eleanor had made a choice, and that choice was love. Late one night, she stood again before the mirror, but this time, her reflection was different. Her eyes were no longer hollow, her shoulders no longer bent under invisible weight. She looked whole. She whispered to herself, "I wanted children my whole life. I just never knew they would come to me this way." Behind her, Ethan's voice called softly, "Mom, are you coming?" Her lips curved into a smile. "Yes, darling, I'm coming." The decision was made. The papers were signed. The children were hers. But outside those mansion gates, the Hayes empire was still trembling, and enemies were sharpening their knives. Eleanor had chosen love over fear, but in the world of wealth and power, love alone would not silence the storm. The next battle would not be fought in her heart. It would be fought in the public eye. The mansion had changed. Once, it was a cavern of silence, marble floors echoing with nothing but the sound of Eleanor's heels. Now, it pulsed with life. Children's laughter ricocheted off the high ceilings. Toys lay scattered on rugs that once held nothing but polished emptiness. And the air carried not just the scent of lemon polish, but warm bread, crayons, and spilled juice. Eleanor sometimes stood at the top of the grand staircase, listening, smiling faintly to herself. There had been days when she thought the silence would suffocate her. Now she knew silence had simply been waiting to be broken. Ethan thrived in ways she hadn't imagined. The first morning he walked into school in his crisp uniform, his shoes polished, collar straightened. He looked like a boy stepping into a new skin. Eleanor had knelt down at the door, adjusting his tie. "Hold your head high," she told him. "You've survived storms most kids can't imagine. Let them laugh if they want. You're already stronger than they'll ever be." Ethan had nodded, though his eyes betrayed his nerves. But when he returned that afternoon, he carried a small grin. "They asked me where I came from," he said. "I told them, and some laughed. But one boy said, 'You're tough.'" Eleanor had kissed his forehead, something she never imagined herself doing, and whispered, "You are tough, but you're also kind. Don't ever lose either." The twins, Lily and Grace, grew stronger each day. Their frail bodies filled out with round cheeks and bright energy. They toddled through the hallways, giggling at their reflections in the glass. Eleanor found herself chasing after them, her once perfect hair tangled, her silk blouses stained with applesauce, and she discovered she didn't care. One evening, the twins had crawled into her lap uninvited. Grace fell asleep against her shoulder. Lily tugged at her necklace until Eleanor laughed aloud, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. It struck her then. This house wasn't a museum anymore. It was a home. Eleanor also took it upon herself to teach Ethan what no classroom could. In the mornings, she sat with him at the dining table, showing him how to read balance sheets, how to track expenses, how to think of money not just as survival, but as stewardship. At first, Ethan struggled. Numbers swam in front of him, and he would frown, embarrassed. But Eleanor's patience surprised even herself. She explained, encouraged, and when frustration clouded his face, she reminded him, "Every empire begins with learning. Don't aim to be perfect. Aim to be better today than yesterday." One night, she caught him staying up past midnight, scribbling in a notebook she had given him. "What are you writing?" she asked gently. Ethan blushed. "My dreams," he admitted. "To open a business one day. Maybe help kids like me." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with pride. That same notebook, once empty, was now filled with possibility. The transformation wasn't only theirs. It was hers. Eleanor Hayes, the woman once defined by icy elegance, who had spent years locked in grief and betrayal, was learning to laugh again, to cry freely, to sit on the floor surrounded by blocks and finger paint, without feeling ridiculous. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized herself. Not because she looked older, though she did, but because she looked alive. In America, there is a phrase often spoken in quiet tones: second chance. It carries weight in this culture, because the nation itself is built on reinvention, on immigrants who left old worlds to start anew, on individuals who fell, failed, but stood again. Eleanor understood now that her life had been granted such a chance, not through wealth, not through Richard's empire, but through 3 children who had walked into her storm and turned it into a dawn. Second chances are celebrated in America's stories. The ex-con who becomes a community leader, the addict who recovers and builds a family, the orphan who finds love in unexpected arms. And now, she thought, perhaps the betrayed widow who became a mother. Oprah Winfrey had once said, "Biology is the least of what makes someone a mother." Eleanor carried that phrase in her heart. Every day she lived it, choosing motherhood not as duty, but as identity. Of course, challenges remained. Not every night was easy. There were fevers that sent the twins to the hospital at dawn. There were bullies at school who mocked Ethan for his past. There were whispers in the business world, shareholders questioning her judgment for distracting herself with charity cases. But Eleanor no longer bowed under pressure. Each challenge became proof of her resolve. Each storm only solidified the foundation of the family she was building. One afternoon, she hosted a small gathering in the garden. Friends, a few allies from the board, and neighbors came. The twins ran barefoot on the grass, chasing bubbles. Ethan played a hesitant melody on the piano, his fingers still uncertain but full of heart. A guest whispered to another, "She's changed. Look at her. She's happy." Eleanor overheard but didn't mind. Yes, she had changed. She was no longer the woman preserved in silence, nor the woman broken by betrayal. She was someone new, someone reborn through the very children she once saw as a threat. As night fell, Ethan came to sit beside her on the patio steps. "Mom," he said, the word still new on his tongue, still powerful in her heart. "Do you think we really belong here? In this house, in this life?" Eleanor placed an arm around his shoulders. "You don't just belong here, Ethan. You make this place real. Without you, without Lily and Grace, it's just walls and marble. You've given me back my life." Ethan leaned into her, silent. Above them, the stars stretched wide across the California sky. The mansion was no longer a fortress of grief. It was alive, chaotic, imperfect, radiant. It was proof that even the most broken story could be rewritten. And Eleanor Hayes, for the first time in years, was not afraid of the future. But while the mansion filled with laughter, beyond its gates, whispers grew louder. The world was not done with Eleanor Hayes, and the next battle would test not just her family, but everything she had built. The mansion's gates opened on a crisp autumn morning in Los Angeles. But this time, it wasn't a convoy of lawyers or reporters that rolled through. It was school buses filled with children, boys and girls in worn-out sneakers, patched jackets, and shy smiles. On the front lawn, under a white tent decorated with simple banners, stood Eleanor Hayes. Beside her was Ethan, taller now, his posture straight, his suit well-fitted but not arrogant. And between them, on a plaque draped with cloth, were the words, soon to be revealed: "The Sarah Foundation, for every child who deserves a home." The speeches began. A few city officials spoke politely. A social worker shared statistics that weighed heavy on the crowd. On any given night in America, more than 30,000 children are homeless, sleeping in cars, in shelters, or on the streets. In Los Angeles County alone, over 3,000 foster children age out of the system each year with no family to fall back on. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She stepped to the microphone, the wind lifting her hair slightly. She no longer looked like the icy socialite of yesterday. Her face was softer now, lined with both pain and grace, her voice steady with conviction. "I once lived in silence," she began. "A mansion filled with everything money could buy, and yet it was empty. I thought wealth was security. I thought success was family. But life taught me something different." Her eyes moved to Ethan, then to Lily and Grace, sitting in the front row with their nanny, clapping hands together like they were cheering for her. "These children changed me. They showed me that money cannot buy family. They showed me that forgiveness does not erase pain, but it can open the door to a future worth walking into. And they reminded me that true family, here in America and everywhere, is built on love, not just blood." The audience was quiet, hanging on every word. Some dabbed their eyes with tissues. Others nodded as if hearing a truth they'd always known but rarely spoken aloud. "That is why I have founded the Sarah Foundation," Eleanor continued. "Named after the woman who, despite her own struggles, gave Richard's children life. This foundation will provide housing, education, and mentorship for homeless and foster youth across this nation. Because no child should ever wonder if they are wanted. Every child deserves a second chance." She pulled the cloth from the plaque. The words gleamed in the sunlight. "Sarah Foundation, building homes of the heart." Applause thundered across the lawn, but Eleanor's gaze lingered on Ethan, her son now in name and in truth. And in his eyes she saw not the boy shivering in the rain, but the young man stepping into his destiny. That evening, after the ceremony, Eleanor found Ethan in the study. He was hunched over a stack of books, scribbling notes furiously. "What are you working on?" she asked, amused. He looked up, cheeks flushed. "I've been reading about family law, about foster care rights, about adoption cases. I think I want to be a lawyer, to fight for kids like me, kids who don't have anyone to stand up for them." Eleanor's throat tightened. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Finally, she managed, "You'd be brilliant." Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. It's a long road. Law school, bar exams. I don't even know if I'm smart enough. Eleanor crossed the room, placed her hands firmly on his shoulders. You are more than smart enough. You survived things most adults would break under. And if the law is your calling, then I will move heaven and earth to see you there. Ethan smiled, but his eyes glistened. Then I'll do it. For Lily. For Grace. For every kid who needs someone in their corner. And in that moment, Eleanor realized her legacy would not be measured only in the wealth she left behind, but in the fire she had helped light in this boy's heart. Life inside the mansion settled into a rhythm. The once sterile dining room now rang with laughter and spilled milk. The long hallways, once echoing with Eleanor's lonely footsteps, now carried the patter of little feet chasing after each other. Ethan grew into a young man who could recite case law and still fall asleep on the couch with his sisters curled against him. Lily and Grace blossomed, healthy, mischievous, alive. Eleanor sometimes stood at her bedroom window, watching the garden below where the children played. And she thought, this is what rebirth looks like. Not the return of what was lost, not the erasure of betrayal, but the creation of something new, something stronger, something rooted not in silence, but in love. American culture has always celebrated the idea of reinvention. The immigrant who builds a life from nothing. The addict who finds recovery. The ex-prisoner who becomes a mentor. And the family pieced together from strangers who become something more than kin, something chosen. The foster care system, for all its flaws, embodies this idea. Every adoption, every foster placement is a statement that love can be chosen, that belonging can be built, that second chances matter. The Sarah Foundation became Eleanor's way of adding her voice to that movement. Her billions no longer sat idle in trusts and estates. They built shelters, funded schools, provided legal aid for foster youth aging out of the system. It was, in every sense, a legacy of love. Years later, at a gala for the foundation, Eleanor was introduced as the woman who turned betrayal into hope. She smiled, but she knew the truth was simpler. She had turned silence into laughter, loneliness into belonging. And as Ethan stood beside her, giving his first public speech about his dream of becoming a lawyer, she felt a pride deeper than any business award, deeper than any fortune. Her legacy was alive. It had names, it had faces, it had laughter. The lessons were clear. Money could build walls and empires, but it could not buy family. Forgiveness could not erase the scars of betrayal, but it could soften the ground enough to plant seeds of new beginnings. And family, in America as in the world, was not written only in blood, but in the daily choices to love, to protect, to stay. Eleanor Hayes had once been a widow trapped in silence. Now she was a mother, a fighter, a builder of second chances. And the mansion that once echoed with emptiness now carried a different sound. The eternal echo of love reborn. And so, Eleanor's story reminds us all. Life does not end with betrayal. It begins again with love. A love that builds, protects, and endures. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black Voice Matter for more powerful journeys of resilience, hope, and second chances. And tell us in the comments, what does family mean to you? Because here, every voice matters.